Hi, everybody. And this video is actually being done for two unrelated but sort of related reasons. I wanted to make a short video to test the scene masking capability in Final Cut. And you can judge for yourself whether or not it's successful. I'm using it right now. However, in doing that, it kind of raised the how do I put this, the technical fetishist in me, and thinking about the various technologies I have to use for my video production and whether or not I wanted to enhance those in other ways. And so I started thinking about whether or not I need a new monitor for editing, and also perhaps more important, whether or not I wanted to indulge in buying an anamorphic lens for my pocket camera. Now, if you don't know what an anamorphic lens is or why it would be an issue, I'll get into that. But anyway, this is sort of talking about how technology influences me, all of us, and what can be done with these tools. And I'll just shut up and just move on from there. The first thing to talk about in terms of aspect ratio, which is what we're talking about when we talk about the screen size, is that this has been a long-standing issue in film and video and television production. Now, the standard aspect ratio for several decades was 4:3 or 1.33. This is the aspect ratio of classical Hollywood, more or less up until the 60s as a standard. Because it was the standard when television was invented, they too used 4:3 as the basic aspect ratio. However, as film in the 50s had to deal with the competition of television, the studios wanted to come up with something that would provide an experience that people could not get on their home television. And one of the things they came up with was widescreen. Now, the most important of these developments was Cinerama, which I'm not going to talk about because it's actually sort of a separate topic, and CinemaScope, which is more of a kind of downscale version of what they were trying to do with Cinerama. The first CinemaScope feature was the Robe, made in the 50s. And CinemaScope, the original aspect ratio was 2.55 to 1, obviously much wider than the television screen. And that was the whole idea, that it would be bigger than what people could get on their TV screen. However, one of the problems, of course, is that when the studios decided to market their movies to television, how do you fit that into the television screen? Now, there are a couple of solutions. One of is the infamous pan and scan. And those of you who are younger watching this, you may never even have heard of pan and scan. Pan and scan basically was using the full vertical height of the television screen. And then when the image was too wide and the action had to follow, they would do an optical pan to move the image around. That's virtually not done anymore because it's not really necessary. Instead, the other option is so-called letterboxing. Now, letterboxing is still with us, although in somewhat different ways than initially employed. And I can talk a little bit about letterboxing. Actually, sort of the beginning of my career as a video producer was working at the Criterion Collection and focusing on films that were wider than 133 and what we had to do in order to fit them into what was still the dominant 4:3 aspect ratio for television and video. So that's where the letterbox comes in, where instead of trying to fill the TV screen, it was accepted that you couldn't fill the TV screen if you wanted to have the full width of the widescreen image. It's important to recognize that widescreen means wide only in comparison to the standard classic Academy ratio, 133. And there are actually several different aspect ratios. And you may have noticed at YouTube that recently there have been a lot of videos about people advocating other aspect ratios besides what is current in broadcast television or in video, which is 16:9. Now, I'll get into 16:9 in a second. Before we go there, though, I want to get back to what happened after the introduction of CinemaScope, because the wider than TV image was sort of became almost synonymous with real filmmaking or mainstream big budget filmmaking. Now, originally, the CinemaScope image was used in projects that really required wide things. It quickly became something that was used for spectacle. And certainly the state of big screen spectacles in the late 50s and early 60s exploit that quite a bit. However, as people became used to the wider than TV image, the kind of expense that would go into using the Panavision or the CinemaScope frame was not really suitable for most projects. And what they came up with, in fact, were kind of intermediate ratios. And the two most familiar of these are 185 and 166. You can kind of call them European widescreen in the sense that it was mainly European filmmakers who used it. Now, the difference between those and television is simply that in these intermediate ratios, they would photograph with the 133 frame in the camera, but then in post-production, they would mat out the top and bottom to produce a more horizontal image, and then that would be blown up in exhibition. So in other words, what you're really seeing in those aspect ratios is the 133 frame that's been reduced in size in printing and then blown up in the theater to fill a wider than 133 image. Now, that may sound like a cheap and shoddy solution, but in fact, the vast majority of widescreen films are in one of those ratios because most of the time producers don't want to go to the extra complexity of shooting in anamorphic. Anamorphic is you take any frame and you use an anamorphic lens, which if you were to look at the image without any kind of alteration, it would be compressed. So if the field of view is from here to here in the anamorphic image, the field of view might be out here, but it's squished so that it will fit in this narrower range. And you have probably encountered this at some point where you see a film where everyone looks kind of squished in, they look like El Greco figures. And that's the reason. It's because it really should be shown out. And so what happens with anamorphic photography is they will produce this squished image, and then in the theater, you have a corresponding lens for the projector, which stretches it back out. So it's genuinely wide. So that is how CinemaScope is produced. And as I said, the original aspect ratio was 255. That came down to about 235, and it's popularly thought of as Panavision. Panavision is actually a company that produces lenses and cameras, but it's often associated with the 235 aspect ratio. And so the 235 aspect ratio is more or less now considered like real widescreen. It's also it's the aspect ratio I noticed of many of the TVs that are, or computer monitors that are for sale, and the anamorphic lens that I'm thinking of getting for the Pocket will produce a 235 image. Okay, so that's the quick version. And by the way, if you want to go into this in more depth, I recommend a couple of books, including this one. Can you read it? Widescreen Movies by Robert Carr and Alan Hayes, R.M. Hayes, sorry. And they will go into the history of how the various aspect ratios came about and why, and the aspect ratios of different films. This, by the way, was very useful for me as a producer Criterion, because if we really had any doubt about how a particular film was released in the theaters, they covered a lot of that, and we could look it up to see, what was the aspect ratio for La Dolce Vita. In the initial days, at least, CinemaScope and Panavision were more or less associated with epics because they seemed to be the best way of exploiting the extra field of view. However, over time, the technology became so familiar that you could use it pretty much anywhere if you had the subject matter that was appropriate for it. So that's really the issue here, and it's my personal issue about whether or not I want to invest in these new tools, because I don't know if I'm going to have the ability to produce anything that would really use them, or I should say demand them. But on the other hand, yeah, I've wanted to have that aspect ratio show for a long, long time. Parenthetically, I'll give you a personal story here. When I was a production student at UCLA, one of the first things they gave us was a list of the equipment that was available to us for shooting our projects. And I looked through, and I was, lo and behold, they actually had a 16 millimeter Panavision camera. I said, "Oh yes, yes, I want to use that." And my big project at UCLA called the Off Season, I had every intention of shooting it with that camera. And so when I came to reserve my equipment, they wouldn't let me use it. I have no idea why, and I've never known anybody who was able to use it, which raises the question of why they had it if they weren't going to use it, but I couldn't use it. So the off-season, I did think, definitely warranted that kind of wide image, and my cameraman and I did whatever we could to exploit the best that we could, but we weren't able to shoot in widescreen. But I've had a long, long fascination with being able to shoot in 235, and so I probably will give in to the impulse. But getting back to my major point, the question is, what really is the appropriate material? You could argue that what's appropriate is what you use it for. That's to say, if you use it and it comes out well, that's all that really matters. And in a sense, that's true. But I would say that because it offered new challenges, new opportunities, that widescreen, by which again I'm thinking like Panavision, offered a new approach that several filmmakers used very expressively. For example, if you're familiar with Robert Altman's films, many of the films he made in the 70s used anamorphic cinematography. And they aren't epics, but he knew how to use the extra space in the frame and the manipulation of space in a very interesting way that was not possible before. So again, use it for whatever way you're going to use it. But the point being that, like any artistic question, what it really comes down to is having a sense of composition, and that what might seem like a good idea in one way, it won't work all that well in another. I'll give you a concrete example. In the 60s, in an effort to re-release Gone with the Wind, which was shot in Academy ratio 1:33, MGM decided, oh, well, we'll create a widescreen version. By which what they did was they took the 1:33 elements, cropped it for 185 and released it in 185. And then, of course, we now would think of that as being rather barbaric. And the days when I worked at Criterion, at that point, there was already enough of a reaction against the kind of thing that, although we never did Gone with the Wind, the idea was, well, what do we work from? Because a lot of the 133 elements were lost. So if you want to go back to 133, well, they're not there anymore because they were so in love with the idea of releasing in widescreen that they butchered it by matting it top and bottom for 185. So that's the kind of problem that you don't want to create for yourself in choosing one aspect ratio over another. I have not talked about 16:9 very much, which of course is the aspect ratio certainly most of you younger viewers are familiar with, but is effectively the standard at this point. Now, 16:9 has an interesting history too, because you may wonder how anyone ever came up with it. Well, think about it for a second. 16:9 is 4:3 squared. That's not incidental, because that's the kind of easy way to take established technology in 4:3 and expand it to a wider image. Now, 16:9 is not like 185 or 166. It's not like it's arbitrarily cropping top and bottom and then blowing it up. No, it is genuinely more information than a 133 frame. But it doesn't really have any rationale beyond a technical rationale. And I remember I had a conversation with an award-winning cinematographer back in the early days of when HD was just on the verge of becoming fairly available. This is back when it was big news that one of the Star Wars films was being shot in HD. But anyway, we were talking about where did they ever come up with 16:9? And he said, yeah, the obvious choice should be 2:1. But the point is that 16 by 9 is something of a compromise. It's a good compromise because when you think about it, it is able to cover certainly European widescreen because it's a little wider than 166 and a little narrower than 185. So you can use the 16 by 9 with either of those without any significant loss or change. It's not so great with Panavision because Panavision is still wider, and so you still have letterboxing. And of course, it's not good for older films that were shot in Academy, which is why you have pillaring, that's to say the black on either side of the 133 frame. But what it all comes down to is that this is obviously a very complicated matter, and that it's not easy to figure out what is the best choice. So I will again close with my longtime fascination with Panavision and say that's what I always wanted. And I probably will indulge myself, but it's going to take some bit of convincing because I have, at this point at least, I don't have subject matter that I think is really appropriate for it. So in the meantime, 16 by 9 is a definite good compromise. And after all of that, hopefully you learn something. And again, I recommend Karin Hayes as a source of information about widescreen movie. And John Belton, a film historian, wrote a book called Widescreen Cinema. That also talks about a lot of these things. And anyway, hopefully that's illuminating. And thanks for listening to this long-winded bit of personal indulgence. And I'll talk with you later.